that's true, at least to our message today, is that we're going to be rip-roaring all over the place in the NT. And the NT, by the way, is pastor slang for the New Testament. So if you feel like we're moving too fast and you didn't get all the addresses that pop out, all the cross-references, we have notes in our app, and you can follow along with those notes, and that way you'll have everything there, and you can refer to it later and fill in some blanks as you go, because we're going to be racing all over the place today. And we're going to be doing that because this was a message originally. I wrote this a number of months ago, and the only thing that got in the way of communicating that was an epic windstorm that destroyed half our town. So this was during the windstorm. I couldn't even get to the school that day, and so we put that on pause, and we're like, hey, there's going to be a Sunday that comes up. We can do this again. Boom. You're welcome. Here it is. All right. So we're going to be going all over the place. It's kind of a one-off message, but I think it's a really important message for us. I know it's one that's important for me that I need to be reminded of, and it really has to do with something that's I think critical to something we try to say as a church. One of the things we say, I don't know, every few months is that as a church, we don't want something from you, but rather we want something for you. All right? And so what we're trying to say in that is that we're not looking at you and saying, all right, we want to use you, we want to guilt you, we want to shame you, we want to exploit you, we want to kind of capitalize on your abilities and resources and money so we can create this epic, cool church. Like, our heart is not trying to get something from you. Rather, our heart is we want something for you. We want you to grow and be encouraged and enriched and coached and blessed in the endeavors of Redemption Church. And so again, what's true to us, what makes us tick, and pretty much how we look at every week is how can we give something to them, right? Because we want something for them. We don't want something simply from them. God, on the other hand, he wants something from you. He does, right? You have an entire Bible that communicates how he wants something from you. And this is why we have things like laws and commands and codes and warnings and wisdom and all of this, because he says, man, this is what I want from you. But he wants it from you because at the deep core of all of that stuff is something for you. He wants you to have an abundance of life that only he provides. In fact, in the Gospel of John, this was Jesus' big idea. He says life, life, life all over the place. And in John 10:10, he says, I came to give you life and to have a life that's abundant. That's his objective for you. So when he gives all of these different things that he wants from you, it's because ultimately he wants for you abundance. In fact, it reminds me of a coach, right? If a coach approaches her team and she has these expectations, right? She's not doing that because she's like, how do I make their lives terrible? How do I put a bunch of burden on them? How do I push them and cajole them into a place that I want them to be? No, she's not doing it that way. She does want something from them, their best. But she wants their best because she knows when they deliver and they win and they're victors, they get what they most desire. So it's ultimately something for. And so this is what we want to begin to own with what God says to us. He ultimately wants something for our lives, which is why he wants something from our lives. And if there's anything we know about the Christian life, is while we are born again in an instant, once we're born, then we're really built. Right? And that's a lifelong process where he's doing things and he's growing us and shaping us and conforming us more and more to the image of Jesus, which is the ultimate goal, that we want to be more like Jesus than anything else. And so he begins to coach and train and develop us to be more like the one who is the perfect representation of what humanity is supposed to be. So again, he seeks something from us so he can give something to us and for us. In fact, in the Gospel of John, we see this in the final recorded prayer of Jesus, which I love the prayer in John 17 because you should read it as a prayer that Jesus spoke for you, right? Not simply like, well, he said this 2,000 years ago and there's a group of people that caught wind of his prayer. It's a private prayer, which then, because it's recorded, the Holy Spirit wanted to make sure that we all knew a private prayer that Jesus prayed, and it's a prayer for every single one of us. So I should read John 17 and say, this is how Jesus prayed for Matt Boswell 2,000 years ago. He knew there would be this dude in Duvall in 2019, and he prayed for me. And this is what he prayed, and he prayed for you. Father, sanctify them in the truth. Your word, right? Your word, it's truth. For their sake, I consecrate myself that they may also be sanctified in truth. Now, when you read that passage, it's filled with all sorts of highfalutin theological jargon, right? You're like consecrated, sanctified. We do not talk like this when we're hanging out at Denny's, right? We don't use these words in everyday life. But if we distilled it down and tried to modernize it and go, what is he saying? What he's saying when he talks about being consecrated is he says, I'm uncommon. I'm going to do something that is radically uncommon. I am God who's going to become a servant. That's uncommon. And I will be sinless as a human being, and that's uncommon. And as a sinless servant, I will lay my life down, take their sin, give them my righteousness. That is uncommon. And he's doing this in a kind of a gesture of love that displays mercy and justness equally. And so because he does this, he displays mercy and justness in love in a very uncommon way. That's his consecrated state. Because of that, he then wants to apply those ideas to our life so that we grow into becoming the same type of spirit or attitude, that we're willing to be servants, lay ourselves down, do it for the greater good, do it for God's glory, that we would love and mercy and justness. And so that's the idea of being sanctified. In fact, the New Living Translation says it a little differently, and I like the way it says it. Jesus prays, make them holy by your truth. Teach them your word, which is truth. He says, I give myself as a holy sacrifice for them so they can be made holy by your truth. See, this word holy is familiar to us as a church. Like we went through this a ton this year, didn't we? We went through Leviticus, which is all about holiness. We went through Galatians, which is the sequel to Leviticus. And the essence of holiness is, again, what I just said. It's love displayed in mercy and justness. And so when Jesus did all that he did, he was both merciful to us and fulfilled justness toward God so that we could again grow in those same traits and attributes in heart, that we would show love to the world around us in mercy and justness, that we would be grown into that same concept. That's the heart. Now, what's interesting to me about what he says here, though, is I want you to notice the core of the prayer. The core of the prayer is not Jesus saying, Father, help my people to stop being stupid and help them to get a grip on their lives and to start working hard to grow in such a way that they look more like me. That is not the prayer. Who is the instrument and the source of growth in our lives in this passage? Is it us? No, he's asking that the Father would do this. Father, you grow them. You make them holy. You are the one that develops them. That is what he's praying for here. And I think this is vital for us to understand that God is the one who grows us. We don't grow ourselves. And that's tricky because I think that's a trap that we fall into. I think there's one of two traps. One is we think it's our job to do things to grow ourselves spiritually. And we even talk about this with one another. We're like, hey, what are you doing to grow? How have you been growing lately? Right? As though it's somehow going to be something that we're accomplishing or we're doing. That's one trap. The other trap, and this one's more destructive, we think it's our job to grow other people, right? And so we start looking at how do I help them grow? And man, if you go down either one of those roads, right, you're working above your pay grade. We don't have the skill set to grow ourselves, and we certainly don't have the skill set to grow other people. We just don't. If we try to do that, it turns into just mayhem or bedlam or frustration, irritation, and failure, right? It's just sort of the way it all works out. And I've known people in the church that have since walked away from the Christian faith, and many of them walked away because there was somebody in their life that was trying to grow them. And what happens is that you start to put all these expectations, manipulations, things like that into their life, like you need to do this, you need to stop doing that. There's this sense of guilt or shame or drive or whatever. And in the end, it's so overwhelming and so discouraging. They go, forget it. You're trying to accelerate something that only God can do in my life, but you're trying to play the role of God, and I'm done, and I'm walking away because this is too oppressive. I mean, that's happened to people. And the reason it happens is because sometimes we lose sight of the fact that real growth is something that only comes by way of God, because real growth is something that is dealt with in the heart, and only God has access to the human heart, whether it be mine or another person's. I can't even quite have access to my heart in the same way that God can have access. In fact, in Romans, we see Paul begin to deal with this. Now, in Romans 2 is going to be where we're looking, but you have to understand kind of the arc of Romans 1 through 3. Those first 3 chapters, Paul's building a case. And his case is that all of us are easily self-deceived. All of us are ultimately sinful. We pursue fractured and broken things. And it doesn't matter our context. We're just going to do it differently depending on our context. So in Romans 1, the context is people that have no relationship to the God of the Bible. They don't follow the Old Testament law. They don't have any knowledge of those things. They're just sinful. And Paul says, man, here's proof that they're sinful. They're outside of God's norms. And so they have these behaviors. But he gets to chapter 2 and he says, but then there's religious people. And religious people think that because they have the Bible, because they're doing the law, they're good. And Paul has to make this case and says, no, they're sinful for a whole different set of reasons. And sometimes their sin is because they think they're good, because they do the book, that makes them okay. And Paul has to say, no, they're not okay, and here's why. And you got to take ownership of your sin. Therefore, he goes into chapter 3 and says, basically, everybody is sinful, and everybody needs the grace of Christ and the good news of Jesus. That's the argument he makes. Well, in chapter 2, he begins to show what the real core thing is and why, again, I'm advocating that only God can grow us. So he's talking about Jews who think they're right with God because they do good things, but ultimately he says your heart is wrong, and here's the ultimate thing. A true Jew, what he means by that is a person with a true relationship with God, is one whose heart is right with God. And true circumcision, which is about commitment. Circumcision is a symbol of commitment or promise or covenant. True commitment is not merely obeying the letter of the law, but rather it is a change of heart produced by the Spirit. And a person with a changed heart seeks praise from God. They don't seek the accolades or pat on the back from people. So a number of things stand out to me in this little section here. First of all, the key to growth is what? The heart. And only God, apparently, according to this, can seize upon the heart, because what's he say? A heart produced by the Spirit. A change of heart produced by the Spirit. Not by Matt's white-knuckling it, Matt's wherewithal, Matt's determination to be a good guy. That's not it, because that would be the Jews of chapter 2. We're just going to work hard at it. He goes, no, that's not it. It's the Spirit that produces a change, right? And because it's the Spirit that produces a change, he is the only one that can lay in us an ownership of desire to be different. But here's the thing about this that's so good. When he does the growing, then it's real. If he doesn't do the growing and we just try to be kind of doing it on our own, then you don't have real faith, you have religion. And real and religion are two dramatically different things, right? Like if you have religion and you're looking at God's book, but through a religious lens of I just need to be good enough to do what's expected of me here. If you do it that way, it's going to lead to one of two things. You're either going to be a liar or you're going to be a legalist. Because what happens is if you think, I'm just going to do it in my own strength, I'm going to grow myself, I'm going to be determined to make this happen. If you do it that way, what ultimately happens is you fail, but you're surrounded by other people that have the image of getting it all right, and so you lie to look like you fit in. You don't admit your failure. Or you turn into a legalist that is harsh or cold or uncaring with those who fail around you. But when it's real, when the Spirit produces it, there is a humility and there is a dependency and there is a consistency that can flow out of that that's very different. This is why Paul is so committed to the idea of reminding again and again and again, God grows people. It's critical. God grows people. But there's the dreaded but. The but in this is that I would say there are conditions, however, that God uses in the growth process, right? There's sort of this idea of fertilizing that goes on. That if we're in those sweet spots, there is this capacity as God grows to grow us more effectively, more deeply, and more fulfilling than if some of those factors are not necessarily in place. Either way, God's going to do the growing, but some things can accelerate and deepen the growth. This is what I see with Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Now, I love the book of 1st and 2nd Corinthians because it's very raw. You got to understand, Corinth is this port city. It's a very pluralistic city. It reminds me of Seattle, right? Lots of worldviews, lots of ideas, lots of conflicting things. And Paul goes to this particular city at some point, and he is, for the first time you ever see in the book of Acts, he's afraid to share Jesus. It's the weirdest deal. Like, Paul's always like, man, let's go roll, let's do this, it's Jesus. But he gets there and he's like, whoa, I'm kind of freaked out. And if you have a red letter edition, there's the red letters of Jesus, where Jesus shows up to Paul in the book of Acts and is like, bro, I've got many people in this city, don't be afraid. But he needs to be reassured and reinforced that I'm doing something here. And so Paul, with trepidation, shares the good news of Jesus, and people get saved. So in this very pluralistic port city of all kinds of ideas, a church coalesces because the gospel is there, but the people have a lot of baggage, right? There's all kinds of sinful stuff in this community of Christians, and so Paul's trying to sort it all out. And one of those areas of contention is that they're siding up on which person was most important for their spiritual growth. So you got some people in the church going, wow, we're team Paul, and others like, oh, we're team Apollos, and Paul has to roll in and be like, dude, you don't get it. You don't get it. And so this is what he says. He says, I, Paul, I planted, right? I preached the gospel even though I was afraid. And Apollos, he watered. He taught you the Old Testament and how that applies for the new covenant believer in Jesus. He did a great job of that. But God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God. He's so emphatic. Only God is the one who gives the growth, right? This is so critical. I mean, I think about just a few months ago. Remember when we were all standing outside of our houses? We were looking at the front of our house. We were looking at our flower beds, and it was filled with crazy grass and weeds, and it was soaking wet, and we're like, we need to do something with this. And so we decided we'll get rid of the weeds and we're going to start to plant sweet alyssum or daisies or whatever you were going to put in there. And you're kind of looking at that going, I'm going to grow a garden. I'm going to grow a flower bed. And so you planted and you watered and you did all that stuff. But in reality, you really didn't do much for the growth process. Like, God was way ahead of you, right? He's like, no, I'm going to engineer these seeds to have cells, and in the cells, they're going to be able to take the sun and convert it to energy, and then that energy is going to power all of these machines like the size of little micro cities, and they're going to take nutrients, and they're going to move things one at a time like an atom piece by piece to the stem and to the leaf and to the petal, and there's this whole underground system, this whole mechanism of biochemistry in play to grow this stuff, and when you look at all of that, pretty much when you threw Miracle-Gro on, it's like, yeah, you did something. But God was way ahead of you on the rest of it. You did very little to bring the growth. Now, some of you are to blame for killing stuff. That may be true. But really, I mean, God just wired it all in there. And in the same way for us spiritually, while there's watering and there's planting and things like that spiritually, and people put things into our lives, it's God. It's God who does the growing. But what this teaches us, and I think even what Paul would say is, hey, God does the growing, but he uses the planters and the waterers. He uses things to optimize the growth, right? And so when we have things in our life that are consistent, man, that's the sweet spot where God has the ability to do the most growth in our lives. And if we're inconsistent, if we're kind of stifling things that God uses to grow us, he'll still grow us. But the growth may be slower, it may be more painful, it may be, maybe we'll feel a little bit more stunted, right? But the promise is he's going to grow us. I always use a chart. It's kind of like, the upward trajectory. It's just a straight arrow up. Like the promise that God is going to grow us is clear to the Bible, right? Jesus says, what I start, I finish. Paul says, he who began a good work will take it on to completion. So there's promises that we're going to grow. But the way life looks is more like this, right? On the upward arc. I mean, it just is. It just feels like somebody took a balloon, filled it up, let it go on the stock market exchange. Just, but ultimately, he's going to grow us in all that chaos, right? And so this is what we know is that, the upswings are because we're in the right frame of spirit and mind to seek growth from God, and the downtrends sometimes can be when we're not, and we're not optimized for the growth. He's still going to do the growing, but we're better off to focus on being optimized, which is all about being fed up, right? That's why we have the title that we do today. I believe we need to be fed up. Now, typically when we hear that phrase, we think, man, I'm just fed up. I'm fed up with my kids. I'm fed up with my spouse. I'm fed up with my job, with life, with politics, with the news. I'm just fed up, right? It's just frustrated. But I don't mean fed up in that way. I mean the idea of our spiritual growth comes when we're reaching, right? When, again, we're putting ourselves in places where we say, all right, God, I know that I want to level up. And I know that leveling up is going to demand being in a space where you can do the most work in me to level me up. Where I have my life in such a position where I'm kind of drinking you in and drinking in your word and doing certain things that put me in a place that's most reliant on you. That is going to be the way that we are fed up, because all healthy things must be fed to go up. I mean, I think about this even with our youngest when he was born. That final pregnancy created some health things for my wife that we weren't aware of at the time. And by like 6 to 9 months, when we were going to the doctor and they would kind of do the measurements on our son, they're like, he's 90 percentile for height and 5 percentile for weight. So he looked like Gollum from Lord of the Rings, like just a skinny little dude with these long, spindly arms. And it was because he wasn't getting enough nourishment. He wasn't being fed up. Right? And that's what we found out from the health issues, that he just wasn't getting quite enough milk. And so there was all these challenges. And it just reminds me that all healthy things must be fed up. And so in the same way for us spiritually, we have to go, okay, if I'm going to be fed, then it has to be in an upward trajectory. So there needs to be things in my life where I am in pursuit of a place where God can do that work best in me. In fact, in Colossians chapter 2, we see where Paul writes, therefore, as you received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, right? So he's like, man, you've got him. Now you want to do that walk in him. He says, I want you to be rooted and built up. And it's funny because he's changing images. I want you to be rooted like a tree. No, I want you to be built up like a building. Forget it. What I mean is be established. And that's as hard. He's like, whatever it takes, man, you want to be established. But notice the key. It's walking in him. Again, it's not this idea of you working hard, you figuring it out, you being super determined and diligent. No, fed up has a very particular thing. It's a pressing in effect. And so this morning I want to give you 3 simple fed up reminders, right? Just 3, right? You can fill in the blanks in your notes as you see fit. But the first reminder is the most critical to what it means to be fed up. And it has to do with being fed up toward God. Fed up toward God. Here's why I say that. It's very easy to find proxies in faith that substitute for God. So I got to be fed up, therefore I need to read my Bible more. I got to be fed up, so I got to serve more. I got to be fed up, so I need to give more. I need to be fed up, so I obey more. And all those things are awesome. But if the goal isn't God, if God isn't the objective of all of those activities, then it becomes like a proxy. Pretty soon it's not about God, it's just about the activity. And in those activities, eventually it can just become about determination, religion, wherewithal on my own strength or part. And this is why God must be the goal of what we do. Otherwise, these things become kind of hard and oppressive or life-draining over the course of time. So God's the goal. And so in Hebrews, it says this, chapter 11, without faith, it is impossible to please God. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Now, there's a number of things in here that jump out to me. The first thing is kind of this thing I've been pushing a little bit, which is it's faith that is primary in pleasing God. It's not our good works, it's not our good deeds, it's not our compliance that predominantly does that, because if that was the case, Jesus would have loved the religious leaders of his day. But often he looked at them and he says, you know what, with your mouth you say things, and you have activities, and you're very religious, but your heart is far from God. And what he means by that is you don't have a pursuit of God, you just have a pursuit of God's stuff. And so the issue is going to have to be always, I'm in pursuit of God. In fact, this is why it talks about drawing near to him or seeking him, right? That's the objective. That is going to be how we grow. I know in my own life, it's super easy, not just as a pastor, but just as a person, it's super easy to get into all the proxies because those keep you busy. And I don't find myself truly in pursuit of God. I don't find myself trying to draw near. I don't find myself trying to seek him. And that becomes draining. I just become lazy and everything else. And I'm forgetting that, man, I most grow, I'm most in the sweet spot when I want him as the center, right? Not just things, stuff, religion, activity, him. That's where I most grow. And so the writer of Hebrews, he knows this. But he also knows when we draw near, when we seek him, when that is the pursuit in faith, he rewards. He rewards because we seek him. That's what's so awesome. Like the more we draw near, he begins to shape our passions, and he begins to address our failures. That's a part of how he grows us. One part of it is just like he makes us more like focused on a God-centered life. And then the other part is he begins to create this sense of like, man, do my own thing, sin, whatever it is, just doesn't pay off in the same way. He works out both because that is his heart. And so we should be in pursuit of God when things are good. But I would also say when things are terrible, when we are doing our own thing, when we're struggling with whatever our issues are, all the more in the struggle, we should be in a dead sprint in pursuit. Right? Just absolutely saying, man, I need to seek the presence of God even more so because I'm hurting or failing or blowing it in life or just drawn into things that I know are hurtful or harmful to me or others. In fact, earlier in Hebrews, we see this come out in a really cool way. It says this high priest of ours, who is Jesus, he's the mediator between us and God. That's the role he plays. This high priest of ours, he understands our weaknesses, for he faced all the same things that we do, yet he did not sin. Now, what's important to me about that is that it presupposes that the rest of us do, you know? Like, here's what's different about Jesus. He faced all the same, like, pull and draw to things, but he never gave into it, unlike the rest of us, right? He says, but in light of this, because he gets it and he feels for us in this, it says, let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God, and there we will receive his mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it the most. Now, here's the cool thing about this little section to me. I've heard over the years of my being a Christian, people say that sin can't be in the presence of God. Maybe you've heard that too, right? Heaven's so holy, sin can't be in the presence of God. The writer of Hebrews says, not only can it be in the presence of God, he invites it. He invites it. I mean, look at that. Jesus understands our brokenness, and even though he never failed, he says, I get it. I want you to come to the throne. And you don't come to the throne with hat in hand, head laid low, in total shame and embarrassment because you suck, right? He's like, no, you come with boldness to find mercy and grace and relief. That is the love of God. When you're most failing, he says, I want you to come. I want you to experience fullness. I want you to experience life. I want you to have relief and release. No, come boldly to me because that is where I will grow you. So whether we're on a low or we're on a high, the more we press into God, the more God's like, man, I'm really glad you're here. I can work with you in this. I think that is an epic promise. This passage in Hebrews is probably one of my favorite of all because it's so reassuring to know I just can't out-sin the grace of God. He always says, come and come boldly. You are welcomed. Now, what does this mean for our sin? Well, we shouldn't just be like, well, so I just keep sinning and keep coming boldly, right? There should be another component, which is we should be fed up against sin. That's the second thing in your notes. Truly fed up against sin. Now, in one sense, I do mean like fed up, like sick and tired of it. Like we should get to that point of like, I'm just sick and tired. It doesn't pay off. We don't always get there, but we should be there. But the other part is saying, you know what? When I seek to resist those things in my life, I try to resist bitterness, or I try to resist anger, or I try to resist anxiety or fear, any number of things. When I try to do that, even though imperfectly, because we're all going to resist imperfectly, right? But as we seek to resist, God will still use that, and God will bless that, and ultimately God will grow us through all of that. When we go, man, I just don't want to give into that stuff. Now, I think the word sin, unfortunately, gets a bum rap in our current cultural climate because it's seen as a shaming word, right? Or it's somehow kind of accosting to conversation today, or it's seen as archaic, right? And what people, when they hear the word sin, they kind of picture this religious person wagging their finger, right? Oh, you sinners, right? Right? All you evil people except for me. Right? Like that's the way, when they hear the word, that's what they think. But when you read through the New Testament, especially when you understand its original language, which is called Koine Greek, the word sin is different words used with bandwidth or different kind of ideas. And so in one sense, sin means to kind of cross a line. In another sense, sin means to miss a mark, right? And so the cross a line is God says, don't do this. And we go, I'm going to cross the line anyway. I'm going to do it even though you say don't do it. And so those are the obvious ones, right? Like you lie, you're crossing a line. You get yourself into some kind of, crossing a boundary sexually, it's crossing the line. Any number of things, bitterness, anger, frustration, greed, you name it, it's in there, right? Those are the crossing of the line. But the other is to miss the mark. And you picture a dartboard, and he's like, all right, see that center, that bullseye is 100, and we throw our life dart, and we're trying to hit the 100, but sometimes we hit 80 or 50 or 30 or 10 or whatever, and that's to miss the mark. And missing the mark things are things like love God, and we throw the dart, but we don't hit 100%. Or love your neighbor, and we throw and we don't hit 100%. Or love your enemy, right? Or share your faith, or whatever. Like these are the things where we miss the mark. Both categories we're all going to struggle with, whether it be the scandalous sins or what I would call the sanctioned sins that we all kind of turn a blind eye to, like, well, that's not that big a deal. They all hurt. But that's the thing we want to keep in mind, right? Sin, what it does in our lives is it hurts. It holds us back from the potential growth that God wants to bring in our lives, which is why we want to be fed up against that. We want to stand against those things. In fact, in Romans chapter 6, it's one of the best passages on what Christ has done to help us overcome in this area. And it's one of those passages where I'm like, man, I love this. I wish I could own this more than I do. It's one of those, like, man, this is the most idealistic, fantastic concept. I want to just let this sink in more and more in my life because there's a lot of richness to be found here. So Paul starts off, and he says this: we know that our old sinful selves were crucified with Christ so that sin might lose its power in our lives. Now, I want you to check that out for just a second, why this is so cool. We tend to go, hey, Jesus died for my sin, so it's forgiven, it's all dealt with, and that's great. And he's like, yeah, that's totally true. But he also did it so that sin doesn't have this conniving control over you. It's not like you're like, man, sin just took over, I had no power. Like, he's like, no, there's this edge that's been removed. He says, we're no longer slaves to sin, for when we died with Christ, we were set free from the power of sin. Now, this doesn't mean that we were also set free from the draw or the allure, right? We're still tempted. We still struggle. There's things where we know we should do the right thing and we battle out, and sometimes we fail and sometimes we overcome. But again, it should give us this encouragement. He says, so you also, because this is all true, you also should consider yourselves to be dead to the power of sin and alive to God through Christ Jesus. He's like, because this is true, start trying to own it more, which is kind of what I was saying earlier, right? He says, do not let sin control the way you live. Do not give into sinful desires. Do not let any part of your body become an instrument of evil to serve sin. Instead, give yourselves completely to God, for you were dead, but now you have new life. So use your whole body as an instrument to do what is right for the glory of God. Again, there's the goal. God is the goal, right? Sin no longer has mastery over you. Because you no longer live under the requirements of the law, instead you live under the freedom of God's grace. Now, again, a number of things jump out to me in this. First of all, because we're not at sin's mercy, what he's saying in part is start making different choices, right? Like you have some choice to make here. You don't have to fall victim to every whim or desire. Like there is a solution. There is always a way of escape, Paul says in 1 Corinthians, right? From this, he's saying, so don't choose it. If you have a choice, don't choose it. But I want to be clear on the why you and I don't want to choose sin. I think one of, again, the misnomers that exist is you go, man, as a Christian, if I choose sin, here's God getting out of his chair in heaven like an angry dad at the dinner table, right? What are you doing down there, you moron? Stop it out of my table. You know what? That's not why we want to resist. Because in Romans chapter 8, he already says there's no judgment or condemnation because of what Jesus has done. We're in Christ. Christ is in us. God does not look at us as being threatened with condemnation because of Jesus. That's not the case. The reason that we don't want to give into these things is because, again, it hurts. It hurts us, and it hurts others. It stifles life. It takes away fullness, right? If holiness, which is love and mercy and justness, brings flourishing, then sin is about selfishness and it brings decay. And decay always hurts. And so he says, man, you don't want to give into these things. Don't choose these things because they hurt. But the way it's accomplished according to this is not in your resolve, it's his resolve in you. What's it say? Give yourself completely to God. It doesn't say, hey, you're no longer under the confines of sin's power, therefore get off your butt and work hard. It says, no, you have to give yourself completely to God. When we feel that tug, that pull, that temptation, that desire, the solution is not, I'm just going to bite down and fight against it. It should be, man, I'm going straight to the throne. I'm going to the throne with boldness, and I'm looking for mercy and grace and saying, God, help me. Because it's God who grows us. It's God who strengthens us and God who refines us. And what's the result? You live in freedom. You live under the freedom of God's grace, right? And there is something free about when we opt to press in closer versus to give into our own interests. And so it's a great built-in promise. And it's that promise that then helps us more to do the third area where we're really fed up and we grow, and God grows us in very particular ways, and that's fed up through following. Following. We see this in Luke chapter 9, right? Jesus rolls in with probably one of the most famous invitations that he ever uttered. It says, and he, Jesus, said to everybody that was there, not just to the 12, but to everybody, right? If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. Now, I want to say for the record that this is the worst marketing pitch in the history of the world, right? I mean, like if you're starting something off, you're not like, hey, come, sacrifice, die, it'll be excellent. You know, it's like nobody gets excited about that. And so we kind of look at all of those things and go, wow, that's a lot. But here's the central thing. The central thing in this passage is not self-denial. Deny yourself. That's not the central thing because, again, I know atheists that can deny themselves and then take up your cross, which means be willing to die. And I go, well, that can't be the central thing necessarily because soldiers and terrorists are willing to do that. What makes this central for the Christian life is the last part, follow me. See, only Christians do that, right? And so this begins to give us context like, oh, it means I'm to really follow him. I'm supposed to think like he thinks and act like he acts, and I'm supposed to do what he did, and I'm supposed to process as he would process and interact with people as I see him interacting like, oh, I'm following. I'm a follower in training. I'm being built up to be more and more like Jesus. That is the goal. That is the objective. And while there's a lot of ways that we might think, man, this is why I have to be like Jesus, like this and this and this, and we think about all these principles and procedures and policies for Jesus, what I love about Jesus is he does stop to make things simple for us. And in Luke, he gives us what I call a compass command. It's like a due north. He's like, I know you can get all lost in all the commands, all the rules, all the codes, all the verses, but let me start you foundationally and we can work from there. And so this compass command is like that thing where if this happens, everything else falls into place pretty solid. And it's great because it comes right after chapter 9 and chapter 10, right? So the scene begins to unfold. It says, and behold, a lawyer stood up and put him to the test. Really, a lawyer did that. That's a shocker. All right. Said, teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And so Jesus said to him, well, what is written in the law? How do you read it? And so this lawyer says, well, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And so Jesus said to him, you have answered correctly. Do this. Do this. He says, do this, and you will live. Now, this command is brilliant. And it's brilliant for a number of reasons. First of all, it's brilliant because you know what? It's simple. You can distill it down to love God, love people. All the way around, 4 words. You just super simple. You can't forget that. Now, is that easy? No, it's simple. It's not easy. We go, well, it's easy to love God. Is it easy to love God when God wants you to do something you don't want to do? Then it's not always easy to love God. You go, well, it's easy to love people. Is it easy to love your enemies? Your difficult people in life? Well, it's easy to love my family. Really? It's easy to love your family? Some of your family ain't easy to love. Some of your family is your enemy that you need to love, right? Like, it's not easy, but it's simple, it's clear, it's concise, it's to the point. The other thing that makes this so brilliant is it's loaded with tension. I don't know if you see it. I see it every time I read it. Love God and love people. So sometimes we get a conflict. We're like, well, I'm trying to love God by warning people. I'm trying to love God by standing up against people. I'm trying to love God by really rebuking people. And yet Jesus is like, there's times you're going to have to say difficult things to people, but they better know they're loved in the statement that you make. If you're just condescending, you sound arrogant, you sound proud, you sound detached, you just care more about the truth that's said than the person that you're trying to communicate the truth to, you're not loving the person. So there's tension. How do I figure out how to love God and love people? How do I love people in the truth as I love God in the truth? It's not super simple. There are people in my life where I constantly feel that tension. I have to truly love them in a way that they know they're loved. And it's not just me saying, well, I love them. Right? I love them. When I don't truly. Like, I have to figure out the tension and master both, because Jesus didn't say, well, love God, and then way distant second, love people. He just says, no, it's both. Just both, and that's tension. The third thing that makes this so brilliant to me is that love is expressed by what we do. Not by what we say or think or tweet or post, right? By what we do. It's very easy as a Christian to be like, man, I'm Orthodox, I study the Bible, I understand John 3:16, I can exegete it, I know it in Greek, that's good enough for me. It's like, no, if we don't show love, if we don't do the things of love to God and people, we're missing the mark. It's something that's done. And I love this because ultimately he gives a context to what he said back in Luke 9. When he says, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Then he gives this command to love. What he's saying is ultimately, here's how love is displayed. You give yourself away. You give yourself away. You give your ego, you put it to the side, and it's about others more than it's about you. And in that, God blesses you. In fact, I saw a quote this week in an article. I thought it was so good. It says, based on this concept at least, lose yourself in a find yourself world. Right? Our whole world's about find yourself, find your vision, find your dreams, find your goals, find what makes you happy. And Jesus is like, or lose yourself. But if you lose yourself, in other words, he says, I want something from you. He promises he will give something for and to you. What's he say here? You will live. People run around trying to find themselves all the time so that they can have a true, abundant life. And Jesus says, no, you lose yourself, and then there you will live. You don't miss out. You gain even more. And so this is why we're to be fed up toward God, fed up against sin, fed up through following, so that we can lean into what holiness is, which is love and mercy and justness. And we bring that love to loving God and loving others. And from that, he enriches us. Let's go ahead and pray together. Jesus, I thank you for your goodness and your grace and your truth for this day and for how you continue to grow and nurture us. May we truly lean into you, not into our own effort, our own works. May we not get sluggish and lazy and not be in that sweet spot with you. No, may we be in dead set pursuit of you so that from that we find life abundant in you. We thank you in your good and perfect name. Amen.